A key aspect of international economics is the use of protectionism. I'm going to get into the pros and cons of these policies later, but first I think we need to understand why do countries use protectionism. The main reason is to protect domestic industry, and most of the other reasons are subcategories of this or boil into this in some way, shape, or form. Another reason countries use protectionism is to protect sovereignty and protect employment. If countries have no trade barriers, countries with comparative advantage in a certain good or service can export that good or service to the other country, causing domestic industry in the country that's importing these to fall due to being outcompeted in price. For example, the US used to have a strong car manufacturing sector. However, they lost comparative advantage to other countries such as Mexico and China, especially once NAFTA was introduced, because now they no longer had barriers to protectionist barriers to car production in Mexico. So these cars are now cheaper. This led to unemployment, especially in some states where car manufacturing is concentrated. Another reason is to protect from over specialization. One way countries cope with losing these sectors to other countries is to specialize in a certain product, which can be good as it preserves and strengthens that industry. However, if there's any fluctuation in global markets, for example, if that good is a luxury good or if that good stops being demanded, the country's economy will suffer since it's over specialized, over dependent on one product. I guess you could say some oil states in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, are over dependent on oil, as it is their main export. And if that export goes down, the country will suffer. That's not entirely due to protectionism, it's just a good example of the risks of being vulnerable, making your economy vulnerable to being a single export country. Another reason protectionism can happen is due to political reasons. The United States, for example, has sanctions on Iran. This is because of political reasons from way down from the 1970s. Differing political ideologies and political tensions leads to countries putting protectionism as a way of hurting the other country and making them change their policy. Sanctions are also placed on North Korea because of their human rights violations and authoritarianism. So sanctions can be placed for any form of protectionism can be placed due to political disagreements. We also saw this with the U.S.-China trade wars. Another reason why countries enact protectionism is to protect infant industry. A country can be trying to create a new industry, but that industry will be vulnerable and not permitted to grow if they're instantly outcompeted by foreign countries. So protectionism can help ensure a domestic market for that new industry until it grows and gains a foothold. Another reason countries use protectionism is to raise government revenue. This is usually a factor in less developed countries, and protectionism will be placed there as they need any source of revenue. There's usually less tax due to lower incomes, so those countries will enact protectionism to gain tax income or any income, especially with tariffs. Not all forms of income are protectionism. I'll talk about the forms of protectionism later, but not all of these will generate tax revenue, but for example, a tariff will. So that's one way the government can earn money. Another thing is to protect against low quality goods. I believe the US placed a tariff or a ban on Chinese imports for paint a while back. Now it's repealed, it's just a tariff because there were harmful chemicals in the paint that were leading to health effects, which that paint was banned from being domestically used in the US. So protectionism can be used to protect health or to prevent low quality goods. But most of these, once again, boil to protecting domestic industry. Finally, protecting against dumping, also protecting domestic industry. Dumping is when a country sells a large quantity of goods to another country at a cost lower than the cost of production. They're just trying to get rid of these products and flood the market. In the 1970s, I want to say, this happened with the US and India. With genetically modified technology, the US is able to produce a lot more rice, which was not being bought in the domestic US market. So India had a demand for that rice, so the U.S. did dumping. The thing is, the prices fall, which help the Indian consumers. However, the Indian producers were hurt because there's no way they could compete with the American dumping, as it was below market value. So to sell and compete with the American producers, they'd have to not make a profit. They have to lose profit. So there's five main forms of protectionism: tariffs, quotas, sanctions, subsidies, and administrative barriers. I won't get into these in this video because there's separate videos dedicated for each of these. One thing that I will discuss, however, are the negative aspects of protectionism. One con is that it increases prices, domestic prices. There's a reason why foreigners are able to import to different countries. It's because they have comparative advantage. They have a lower price because of that comparative advantage. Domestic producers would be inefficient. However, with the protectionist barriers, it's now cheaper for the consumers to buy from domestic producers, but it's not as cheap as it would have been to buy the imported goods the tariff or without the tariff that was placed on it. Another thing is that it hurts domestic producers that use imported resources. Be careful with this one because mostly it helps domestic producers. However, some domestic producers will be using imported resources that now are more expensive for them, so that'll hurt their cost of production, which hurts the business, can lead to unemployment, but if it's seen on a larger scale, it can also lead to AES shifting left. For example, the Trump administration placed tariffs on imported steel from Japan and other countries, and this helped American steel producers. However, some American firms used these imported steel and now they had to pay a higher price, which hurt them. Finally, it can lead to retaliation and loss of goodwill. When the Trump administration placed tariffs on China, China retaliated back with its own forms of protectionism. This is only one example, and this usually happens once countries place tariffs, and it leads to general loss of goodwill and tensions between those countries. I sort of mentioned this, but there's also less efficiency since now they're no longer promoting the firms in the countries that have competitive advantage. So scarce resources are not being used efficiently in the global market. There's more to protectionism, but I have separate videos dedicated to those, so I'll leave this one here.